Well, hello, founders. Welcome to today's episode of the Gab Lab, the show that is not only dropping financial intelligence that's going to blow your mind, but it's also helping you to build your bottom line. Today's episode is championed by our friends at Community Futures Manitoba. So thanks, team, for putting this through. And today's episode, if you haven't guessed by the title already, we are talking about equipment, the costs, the capacity, and obviously the impact on the bottom line. Our guest today is sitting with us right here, Dustin Bosch. Hello, welcome to the show.
Yes, Tanya, thank you for inviting me.
Oh, well, I am thrilled that you're here. We go back a couple of years. I was trying to put a year on it, and I think it was it 2017, 2000, around there?
Your memory's probably better than mine, but yeah, it is, I think.
And we both still actually are actively involved with board members on an advisory board with a dynamic company. We won't mention any names, but two phenomenal brothers that run a trucking company. And just for everybody listening and watching, Dustin came in and created some magic with respect to their numbers. These were two guys that were looking to nail their numbers and really create efficiencies with respect to their operations. And Dustin, I was blown away by the impact that you had on them and their business. And what was really so phenomenal for me watching is that these weren't major overhauls with respect to the equipment that they had. These were small, minor tweaks and adjustments that they needed to make with respect to the equipment that we were carrying and putting out there on the road, but they had a significant impact on the bottom line. It was crazy to watch you at work there. So
yeah, well, I appreciate that. Yeah. Well, often that is the way it is. It's just some small adjustments, changes makes all the difference in the world.
Beautiful. Well, thank you for being here, because I know that some of those small tweaks that you'll share with our audience are hopefully going to make big impact for them as they move forward here. 2021, first episode of the year, so we're getting off to a strong start. I'm curious to hear your feedback on this. I know that you typically deal with companies that have major pieces of equipment, right? I was speaking to another pro the other day. They called them iron. How much iron do you have in your warehouse? But when I think about businesses that have equipment, for me and my clients, there's construction, there's mining, there's trucking, obviously, where we first met. But I think when I also think about it, I think about printing companies that I work with that have major pieces of equipment. I think about fabrication, manufacturing. In your line of work, have you worked with some really unique industries that might not be thinking this episode's for them, but it's like, oh, no, I really do use equipment in my business?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you say the word equipment and you often think of something that burns diesel, rolls on wheels or tracks, but and that is a majority of what we would do. But I would say, if you look into the dental industry or the medical industry, there's a ton of IT-based technology, and whether it's software specific or it's hardware specific. We've done some of that stuff in the professional services industries, like chiropractors, simple things like the tables that they use or the dentist chairs that we sit in, right? Every industry has a little bit of a form or facet of equipment that they use, and for the most part, it's all financeable.
Beautiful. Well, okay, so let's get into it, because I think that now that we've broadened the scope of who's watching this episode, let's talk about impact on bottom line. And we had a good chuckle, because when we were doing our discovery interview on what could this episode look like, we had a good laugh on one of the top issues really impacting the bottom line for entrepreneurs, and that was, is the equipment a need or a want, right? And I definitely went into some stereotypes there with women and shoes and purses and men and equipment and tools, which necessarily isn't always the fairest thing. But I'm curious to hear from you, like, how do we start breaking down whether that new piece of equipment or a used piece of equipment, is that really necessary?
Yeah, it's I think it's a conversation or a look in the mirror that an entrepreneur has to have with themselves, like understanding the use of the equipment and the need for it and the timeline that it's being needed for. So, because we often think, oh, we pick up a job or a project, and I need that equipment because it's going to make me more money rather than renting it. But without understanding the implications of the carrying costs that can be associated with it, or the borrowing costs that get rolled into financing a piece, oftentimes it could make sense to just rent the piece rather than buy it. And it separates that need versus want paradigm.
Do you find, in my experience working with business owners, sometimes there is this appetite or belief that a new piece of equipment is going to make all the difference to their business. So they want to go buy something new because they believe that that's going to fix potentially existing issues or fault lines within their existing model. And so I guess, first of all, is that something that you notice, that business owners are quick to go rush out and want to go buy new equipment just for the sake of buying new equipment?
Absolutely. It's a bit psychological in a way, or emotional in a way, because companies that are focused on heavy equipment, for instance, they build a bit of a bond with their equipment, because that equipment is what makes them money and provides the livelihood for them. So, without understanding where the company's position is going or the financial health of it currently, sometimes there's a thought that if I buy more equipment, or new equipment specifically, it's going to make me that much more money. So, and then within the industry as well, sometimes the customers that they're working for is asking these companies to bring newer equipment into the fleet so that it looks better on their projects. So absolutely.
And so how do you, when you're working with someone like that that's wanting to bring in new equipment, and I should mention, and sorry, it's at the beginning of this episode, but we talk about your role as vice president in sales, right, with equipment financing specifically. But so you get a business owner that's coming to you saying, I want this new piece of equipment, this is going to make all the difference. How do you walk them through? Is there a process that you walk them through to get them to understand their current equipment utilization? Like, is their foundation solid? What does that process look like for you to get them to kind of see whether or not things are currently working with what they already have?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the first questions I generally ask them is, do they have this equipment in their fleet already?
Okay.
And, that will lead to a yes or no answer. And, if the answer is yes, then, the secondary would be, well, how utilized is that piece of equipment right now? Often it's overlooked that, they could have this piece of equipment that's only being used 50% of the time, and which means it's sitting in their yard the other half of the time. And they may fundamentally believe that they need a second piece in order to get more work, whereas the first piece could handle the job.
Is there a number specifically that you think about, like what is the optimal utilization? Maybe that's loaded because maybe every piece of equipment is different, every manufacturer might be different, but what number would you suggest they strive for with each piece?
I think having a piece of equipment on standby from time to time is not necessarily a bad thing, because it allows them to shift from one project to the other if needed. But I've tried to look for that 80 to 85% utilization on a piece of equipment before we start thinking about, is there a secondary piece that's really needed?
Okay. And then the secondary piece, this is what you were alluding to, where maybe you don't need to buy new for that
Right.
secondary piece. You're starting to get to 80, 85. Maybe it's not a whole new acquisition, but it might be something different. So what options might a founder explore with respect to acquiring a new piece of equipment, do you think?
Yeah, I think a lot of it depends on the type of work that they're doing. So are they looking at long-term sustainability of this piece? Like, do they have the work that would carry them for multiple years, or is it project-based work, whereas they've got it for a month and then they may not have it for a month or two or three later on, right?
Yeah.
So if they understand what type of work they're getting into, then it helps, I guess, form the decision-making process around whether or not I should rent the equipment, because that it may have a higher cost up front to rent it, but because I'm only using it for a short period of time, I'm not incurring all the carry costs and expenses that go along with ownership of a piece.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'll buy the piece because I know, its useful life is for a longer period of time, and I'm going to be able to work it for a longer period of time, and I'm going to capitalize a higher gain off of it that way.
Okay. So we've got renting, we've got buying. Is it ever factored in subcontracting? Like other companies that might have that equipment with the labor attached to it?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a very common method of bringing on additional capacity for a lot of companies. Like, for instance, in the construction and transportation industry, we see it all the time. There's bulge capacity that's needed at any point in time, and they'll just bring on a third party to help them fulfill the need.
Okay. And what are your thoughts on, I remember a trucking company I worked with close to a decade ago. It was a young guy that was starting up, and he had interest from different clients that wanted to utilize the truck, and it made a night and day difference to him. So I'm curious to you as a lender if this would impact you. What he did is he actually went out and got letters of intention or expressions of interest from these potential clients that said, yes, if this guy were to get this sort of truck, this is the business that we would be able to generate for him within this sort of term. Does that influence your decision at all as a lender or financer to be able to get these founders access to capital for new pieces of equipment?
Yeah, absolutely. We see it very commonly in like sole proprietorships or the smaller companies that are looking to expand on their existing work program. If we often will ask for, a letter of intent or a work letter to support the work that would be carried out by the equipment they're looking to purchase. And it just rounds out the story that, there is actually going to be revenue generated by this piece, and that there's going to be a capacity to service the corresponding costs. So yeah. It does carry weight, absolutely.
So I love that you mentioned that, Dustin, because that is the nail on the head. When they can guarantee that business is coming in for that piece of new equipment, then we've established it is a need versus the want, right? So I think that takes care of that piece. But out of curiosity, let's talk about useful life for a little bit, because I think with a lot of business owners, there's always so much to juggle. But here we have another situation where, so now they've got equipment, they're trying to figure out, okay, can they grow their business? Do they need more equipment to grow their business? But can we talk about useful life of the equipment, and how far out should they start to think and contemplate, at what point do these pieces of equipment need to be replaced?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And every piece of equipment or every asset has a different useful life, largely dependent on the application it's going to be used in. For instance, forestry equipment has a shorter useful life because the application is so rough on the equipment itself that, it just depreciates and deteriorates quicker over time. But I think, part of the equation in thinking about useful life is, what am I going to use the equipment for? And how long am I going to use it for? Because that starts to determine whether or not an equipment buy or lease decision is useful for either new equipment or used equipment. Because new equipment obviously will start off with the longest useful life that you can get, because it's fresh, it's never been used. You'll be able to run it out over its course without thinking about replacement or high maintenance repair costs right away. But if you don't have the need to run the equipment all the time, or the need to place the equipment in the workforce as often or as heavily as you would in certain circumstances, a used piece of equipment might make sense. So it might have some hours on it already, might be worn down a little bit already, but for what you're going to be using it for, the anticipated costs associated to it might make a lot of sense, especially being the upfront cost on it much cheaper a lot of the times.
Gotcha. And you know, a part of what I love to bring to the table when I'm talking about founders with numbers is reverse engineering the numbers, right? Like starting out with the end in mind,
Yeah.
knowing what it is that you're looking to build, and then really understanding what does that runway look like, right? What are the phases of growth or the milestones that will get you to that end goal? Sounds like understanding the useful life of each piece of equipment would play into that end game, right? To understand here's what we're going to need to pick up and when. I'm
Yeah.
curious, with the clients that you've worked with, have you worked with any that had a really strong end game in mind and that experienced a lot of success and traction as it pertains to their equipment inventory in that process?
Yeah, I would say I definitely have. Some of the leading, I'll use a construction company, for example. Some of the leading construction companies, they understand the useful life of their equipment very well. So what I mean by that is they know they have a 3-year project and that piece of equipment is going to be used for, 2,000 hours per year. So over 3 years, it'll have 6,000 hours on it by the time it's done at the project. And that piece of equipment might have a useful life of 10,000 hours on it in totality. So they'll know that by the end of that project, they have used 60% of its useful life. And they know at that 60% mark, that's when the repairs and maintenance costs and other ancillary costs associated with the equipment start to elevate. So they just roll it out. So they're on like 3-year cycles where they're bringing equipment in, they use it, they roll it out, and that minimizes their operating costs and increases their bottom line.
Oh, that's huge, Dustin. So what I'm hearing there as like definitely a golden nugget is I don't want to say the reverse engineering, but starting with the end in mind, right? Because I think at least in my work with founders, most are just kind of taking it a day as it comes, right? And hoping business is going to come in and trying to figure out what the dispatcher or whoever is going to do. Whereas the best practices of big business are understanding the hours and the projects projected and attached to each piece of equipment, and knowing months out that they're going to have to start taking action at some point with respect to that replacement, or like you said, the extra investment that's going to be required on each piece, I'm assuming too, right?
Absolutely. Every
Wow.
single piece is different depending on the application, the type of equipment, like they have different useful lives overall. So yeah, they break it down per piece.
Wow, huge. And so last piece, just so everybody listening and watching, just so you know, we're going to turn it over to another segment here in a minute, which is all about the cost, really understanding the true cost of each piece of equipment, because it's not just capital expenditure on the piece of equipment itself. But I'm curious, Dustin, have you noticed, is there software that businesses are using to really be able to track the inventory and the expenses in? Or is it really up to a CFO? Like, how is all of this getting tracked efficiently within these organizations that you've been working with?
There definitely is, and I don't know the names of the software, could be an advocate for them, but I do know that leading companies have good asset management software in place that tracks their fleet, when repairs have been done and gets logged. The hours are being tracked so that they know at any point in time they can go into the system and say, hey, if I'm budgeting for asset replacement in 2021, we know that these 10 pieces of equipment are coming up to be due or will be due in the fiscal year.
Beautiful. So asset management software is what a founder should be Googling out there to get some ideas as to what would better help them in this situation.
Yeah, and there's fleet maintenance software as well that's
Okay.
probably one and the same or tied into that.
Awesome. All right, so we're going to take a brief intermission. This was all about needs versus wants. Understanding, don't go run out and buy a new piece of equipment because you think it's going to solve all the problems, or it's nice to have. And so just a reminder to subscribe so that you can catch all the episodes that are coming out. We're going to be dropping one episode every week. And we're going to catch you in the next segment of this episode, where we're going to get into really calculating the true costs on each piece of equipment. So thanks for watching, and we will see